Last time, we discussed how Charles Darwin came to develop his theory of natural selection, and we ended by summarizing the most salient points of that theory. Let me remind you that Darwin's main contribution was not to establish that evolution occurs. I mean, he helped in that regard, but instead to propose natural selection as a mechanism by which evolution could occur. Now, in a nutshell, Darwin's theory of natural selection runs as follows. There's variation in population. Some of the traits that individuals have in populations are heritable, meaning that this variation can be transmitted genetically from parents to offspring. More individuals are born in a population than can survive, meaning that only some individuals will survive and reproduce. And individuals that do survive and reproduce are not a random subset of the population, but instead those individuals possessing traits that somehow make them better at surviving and reproducing in a particular environment. To the extent that the traits that do so, we call these adaptive traits, are heritable, those heritable adaptive traits will become increasingly represented in a population over time and thus shape the phenotypic characteristics of that population. And that's the process of evolution. Now, there are a couple of additional points I want to make about Darwin's theory of natural selection at this point. The first point is to remind you that natural selection can only act on existing heritable variation. If there's no variation for a particular trait, then selection simply cannot do anything with it. This is why the generation of variation that we've discussed earlier in the context of mutation and genetic recombination is so central to our understanding of evolution. The second point I want to make is that although natural selection acts on individuals, its evolutionary consequences occur in populations. Individuals do not evolve. Instead, evolution is measured as changes in the average characteristics of individuals within a population. Thus, as we begin to talk about evolution and evolutionary mechanisms, we're really making another transition in the hierarchy of biological organization that I introduced at the beginning of the course. A transition from the level of individual organisms, which is the level at which we were discussing Mendelian genetics, to the level of populations of organisms. And it's this point that brings us to today's lecture, in which we're going to look at some examples that illustrate how evolution occurs in populations. Now, we call natural selection a theory, but it's a testable theory, and it's been tested many times. Darwin, in fact, when he proposed the theory, really could only turn to examples of artificial selection, the breeding of domesticated plants and animals, where the selective agent was the breeder, not the environment. Since Darwin's time, however, natural selection has been demonstrated to occur in many, many cases, actually well-documented examples, both in wild populations and in laboratory populations under more controlled circumstances. In this lecture, we're going to take a closer look at a couple of examples in order to better understand how natural selection works. Now, the first example I'll use is a famous one. Actually, it may even be called an infamous one, which involves a small moth living in England, the English peppered moth, with the scientific name Biston bicellaria. This example is notable not because it offers definitive proof for natural selection occurring, as we'll see the direct evidence for this in this case is incomplete, but instead because it was the first widely publicized of natural selection occurring in a wild population over a relatively short time scale, as opposed to being inferred from long-term patterns occurring over a geological time scale. It also provides a good example for illustrating some of the key tenets of natural selection. Well, butterfly collectors are quite a zealous group of natural historians. For literally hundreds of years, professional and amateur entomologists have collected hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of specimens of butterflies and moths from all over the world in order to document variation within populations, between populations, among species, and so forth. As a result, the natural history museums of the world are literally stuffed, filled to the brim, with collections that illustrate various patterns of variation in the phenotypes of butterflies and moths, and many other organisms as well. So, in the case of Biston bicellaria, there's an extensive museum collection that extends back over 150 years or more of the occurrence of this moth in England. Now, if you look specifically at the collection of this species that were made near Manchester, England, you'll notice an interesting thing. Moths that were collected before the 1850s were mostly a pale color. That is, they have pale colored wings with just a sprinkling of dark flecks, which is where they get their name, the peppered moth. Now, there are a few examples that you find in these older collections of dark melanic forms, but most of the moths that are collected are light colored. By contrast, if you look at specimens that were collected a half a century later, around 1900, about 98% of the moths collected are uniformly dark colored, and there are only a few light colored individuals represented. So, the typical wing color phenotype in the population of this moth found around Manchester, England, shifted dramatically from mostly light individuals to mostly dark individuals over a 50-year period. Now, it's well established that wing color is a heritable trait in butterflies and moths. Therefore, the historical change in wing color observed in this population may be consistent with a hypothesis that the shift represents an evolutionary change. Interestingly, this transformation from the 1850s to the early part of the 20th century occurred during Darwin's lifetime. But he never knew about it, of course, and in fact Darwin himself even despaired as to whether one could ever document in a natural population the phenomenon of natural selection. Now, if this change in wing color is an evolutionary transformation, then based on what we know so far, we would expect that natural selection must be acting on these individuals because of their wing color. How might natural selection act in this way? Well, it was in the mid-1950s when an English physician named H.B.D. Kettlewell proposed the following idea. He noticed that the change in moth coloration correlated with the onset of the Industrial Revolution in England. This was a time when coal burning around industrial centers like Manchester produced enormous amount of soot, and this soot settled on everything. Now, the peppered moth is a night-flying moth, and it usually spends the whole day resting on tree trunks. Normally, in the English countryside, these tree trunks that the moth would settle on are covered with light-colored lichens. Well, what Kettlewell suggested was that the tree trunks around Manchester, England, because they became soot-covered, and indeed they did, we can document this, had become considerably darker. Now, what's natural selection doing here? Kettlewell argued that visual predators, such as birds, were hunting these moths during the day. Moths were light-colored, he argued, because when they rested on light-colored lichens, they were cryptic. They couldn't be seen. But what happened when the bark turned dark because of soot was that the light-colored individuals now stood out like a sore thumb, and they were easily found by predators. On the other hand, those few dark-colored individuals that occurred would do much better because their dark coloration would fit in with the now dark background on which they were alighting. So, Kettlewell proposed that natural selection was acting on wing color because of the actions of visual predators that were able to find these individual moths depending on their contrast with their environment. This is a testable hypothesis. Well, in theory it's a testable hypothesis. I mean, it's a little bit hard to test this, but Kettlewell tried to test it the following way. What he did was he took an equal number of dark-colored and light-colored moths and released them into two kinds of woods. He would release an equal number of dark-colored and light-colored moths into woods that were still darkened with soot. And then he would ask which of the moths got eaten more. And when he did this, he reported, he found out that, as he would have expected, the light-colored moths were the ones that were getting eaten because the dark-colored moths were cryptic. Now, if he took the same number of light and dark-colored moths and he put them instead in a forest that was more distant from Manchester, where the bark was still light-colored, he'd get the opposite effect. In this case, the dark-colored moths would stand out in the background, and the birds would find them and eat them much more than the light-colored moths. Now, the results of Kettlewell's experiments are consistent with the idea that natural selection caused by visual